So our reading this morning is from the Reverend Meg Barnhouse, the rock star minister of our church, First Austin, in Austin. She writes, "One of my friends from Alabama has a shrine in the hallway of his house. Over a little shelf with candles on it hangs a picture of Jesus. On one side of Jesus hangs another picture, this one of President Jimmy Carter. On the other side is University of Alabama football coach Bear Bryant. One of the sources of our Unitarian Universalist faith is the prophetic words and deeds of great people. In believing that there is ongoing revelation about the truth of things, one lets go of thinking that all truth has been laid out before us, that a sacred book could have the answers to everything. Truth is revealed through actions and words not only of ancient people, but of people who have made history in our own lifetimes. We also learn from the words and the deeds of the people down the street in our own neighborhood, sitting next to us on the subway, dancing to the swing band while we play the fiddle. I have been thinking for years about whose pictures might make up my shrine. If I were to build one, of course. I might have pictures of Ralph Waldo Emerson, Robin Hood, Margaret Sanger, Bette Midler. I wasn't raised to have heroes in the sense of believing someone was without flaws. My father taught me that the line between creation and destruction runs down the middle of every person. He adored JFK, and maybe he thought of him as a hero, but he was well aware of at least a few of the man's weaknesses. The sense that everyone is flawed has kept me from building a shrine like my friends. It's getting harder and harder to admire people with your whole heart. We come to realize unsavory things about Thomas Jefferson or Jimmy Carter. Someone says Bette Midler wasn't kind to the little people on her way up. Bear Bryant certainly wasn't a perfect hero. Apparently Gandhi had a difficult relationship with his children. Should we allow ourselves to enshrine people who do a variety of deeds, some enlightened and some egregious? Perhaps we could keep our sense of purity if we allow as much of their picture in our shrine as represents the percentage of them that is admirable. So we would have torn up confetti photographs in a montage. I would hate to think how I might have to rip off chunks of my photograph if I wanted to be up there amongst my heroes. If I demand perfection of them, surely I must demand it of myself, right? So I'm stuck. I want to draw from the words and deeds of great people, but how do you tell who is great and who isn't? What if I love some of the things Emerson said and did, and I didn't love others? What if one of my friends is brave and kind, adventuresome, healthy, and skilled, but clumsy at relationships and bad with money? I still admire my friend. The ancient Greek heroes all had flaws, and their gods had flaws. The characters moving through the Hebrew scriptures had flaws, yet they are held up to us as models of faithfulness and bravery. Where did I get this idea that the people in my shrine should be perfect? Where did I get the idea that perfection has anything to do with greatness? The revelation of truth in my life has come from things people have written and said, from a painting by Mark Rothko, and from music by Josquin Dupré. I just got a swift and lovely beyond categorical thinking lesson from a burly Alaskan man in his 70s. His hair was white and somewhat uncombed. His boots were scuffed and his khakis wrinkled. He was getting a pedicure in the Fairbanks nail salon where we were doing the same. That took me aback a little but it was when I saw him hand the lady a bottle of autumn bronze polish that I had to admit that I had looked at him and judged him as a certain type of man. He showed me handily that I had no idea what type of man he was, and for that I thank him. His picture would be in my shrine, for a while at least. Suddenly it has occurred to me that those I enshrine don't have to be the same people year in and year out. Guides need to change as the path changes. I might need a model of insane courage at one point in my life, while at another point I may not be taking the same risks I would were I responsible only for myself. At that point, I may want a model of care and gentle thoroughness. I can relax. Perfection and greatness, I think, are unrelated. I can now respond with equanimity to the people who love to burst my bubble about people I admire by telling me Gandhi's children hated him, or that Bette Midler was rude to them, or that Robin Hood is fictional. I'll just mutter, "Your mom's fictional," under my breath, and light my candles in peace. It's so hard to top Meg Barnhouse. Oh my goodness. I set myself up here. So today's topic is the second source of Unitarian Universalism. The sources being this huge buffet of knowledge and wisdom and inspiration from which we are encouraged to draw in our lives and on our faith journeys. And you know, I've been a UU quite a while now, and I still can't stop talking about how cool this is. This acknowledgement in our faith tradition that wisdom can come and truth can come from so many different places. You know, it's just like in school when we had to use more than one source for a research paper to avoid presenting too narrow a view. My professor is laughing over here. You know, if one source doesn't work for research papers, why should our religious view, our worldview, be limited to a single or a limited set of sources? Our list of sources, our UU bibliography, we might call it, is incredibly expansive. And I know I like it that way. So our second source is words and deeds of prophetic people which challenge us to confront powers and structures of evil with justice, compassion, and the transforming power of love. So let's unpack that. Like a lot of our sources and principles, there's just a lot going on in there that we need to talk about. First, I want to talk about prophetic people. Who are these prophets we're talking about? And what does it mean to be prophetic, especially in a UU context? So I thought I'd share with you today some assorted definitions of a prophet. A prophet is one who utters divinely inspired revelations, such as the writer of one of the prophetic books of the Bible. Or a prophet is one regarded by a group of followers as the final authoritative revealer of God's will, such as Muhammad, the prophet of Allah. Or a prophet is one gifted with more than ordinary spiritual and moral insight. Or a prophet is one who foretells future events, a predictor. Or finally, a prophet can be an effective or leading spokesperson for a cause, doctrine, or group. So sorting through all these various definitions of a prophet, there are a couple of them that I think that might be more relevant to Unitarian Universalists. The first definition I really like is one gifted with more than ordinary spiritual and moral insight. And this definition brings to me a lot of familiar names. Gandhi and Dr. King and Mother Teresa and the Dalai Lama. All of those whose work that puts them at the intersection of spirituality and morality and service and justice. And the other definition I definitely can work with, although I think it's a little bit wimpy, is that a prophet is an effective or leading spokesperson for a cause, doctrine, or group. And that seems to me technically accurate, but calling Gandhi or Dr. King a spokesperson is kind of like a bit of an understatement, wouldn't you say? But then again, the use of the word spokesperson is really important because it implies a person who speaks up. And that's a very, very important aspect of being prophetic. If we go back to the wording of our second source, we find the source itself actually tells us what a prophet is and potentially how to recognize one if you run across one. The source says what these prophetic people do. They tell us to confront powers and structures of evil with justice, compassion, and the transforming power of love. So virtually any voice that tells us to confront the bad things in this world with justice, compassion, and love is most likely a prophetic one. And like Meg Barnhouse emphasized in her reading, All of us here have the power to be prophetic, to be prophets. Being famous or world-renowned is not required to be prophetic. And prophets aren't required to be perfect or to be treated as perfect. We're not talking about idol worship. I think that's why our source tells us to pay heed to the words and deeds of prophetic people. It doesn't put the prophetic people themselves up on pedestals. It's more about the challenge they have put before us, using their actions to guide us. Will we heed their call to confront the powers and structures of evil with justice, compassion, and love? As a minister, I'm required, and I'm actually evaluated on, ask anyone on the comm, I'm actually evaluated on the use of my own prophetic voice. So I show up and demonstrate, and I go to meetings with legislators, and I show up in this incredibly unattractive clerical shirt and collar to remind some big decision makers that God is watching them. That's their theology, not necessarily mine, but I will still use it to the best advantage. And sometimes I have to say hard things that people don't want to hear, like pointing out privilege and implicit bias here and outside of here. It's not easy. It's uncomfortable. It doesn't make me very popular, and people don't always respond well. And keeping up that love and compassion part when confronted with ugliness is really hard. It's so hard, not to sink into those depths of ridicule and demonization and sarcasm. That's one of my personal favorites. And anger. All of those things, that we are being called to actually rise above. So like our other sources and principles, the second source too is really challenging to live by. So much for that watered down, ask for nothing of ourselves religion we are accused of being, right? I mean, we have to confront the powers and structures of evil with justice, compassion, and the transforming power of love. I think that's asking a lot of us, isn't it? I mean, if we're going to confront evil and confront injustice, it also matters how we do it and how we go about it, right? Yeah. I mean, are we really modeling compassion and the transforming power of love in our fight for justice? Or are we just throwing fuel on the fire of disagreement and incivility and hate? And that's definitely something we all need to be thinking about as we approach Election Day, right? Our prophetic guides, our role models, our heroes are important, and they're here to help us. So I'm going to have a little participation today. I'm going to ask that we take about 10 seconds of silence so we can think about our own prophets, living, dead, fictional, the people we might put on our altar. Let's begin. All right, now that you might have someone in mind, let's call out some names.
Casey Blitz. Mr. Spock.
Henry David Thoreau, any more? Bernie. Yeah, one of the young prophets that came to mind for me is Malala, the young woman who became an activist for girls' education and as a result suffered retaliation from the Taliban. And you know what? There's also been a local prophet in the news lately. Last week, Pastor Adam Carrington of Brooks AME Worship Center in the Hillcrest neighborhood, he used his prophetic voice to shed light on the human suffering caused by the city's inaccurate water bills. He said that several neighborhood residents have chosen to cut off their water because they cannot pay the high bills, the mistakenly high bills they received. He also said that some residents had their water cut off by the city because they could not pay their inaccurately high bills. So Pastor Carrington called a meeting and gained the attention of the local media. He's making an effort to help some of the most vulnerable people who are struggling to make ends meet, who have hard enough lives without having to negotiate a bill that is just plain wrong. He's also helping to educate the community on what to do about those inaccurate bills without going to the lengths of having water shut off. So that's what the prophetic voice in the here and now looks like to me. But Unitarian Universalism has its own prophets too. In the book Sources of Our Faith, Inspirational Readings, Kathleen Rollens writes on our second source, "In a religion of deeds, not creeds, we look to the example of our spiritual ancestors and the prophets of our time for the strength and wisdom to do the right thing." Most religious traditions have their founders, their prophets, their sages. UUs are no different. We revere people like Francis David, the first clergy person in the Reformation to proclaim religious tolerance, who said, "We not think alike, to love alike." We hold up Theodore Parker, the radical abolitionist minister, Ralph Waldo Emerson, a leader of the Transcendentalist movement, Susan B. Anthony, who fought for women's suffrage, the Reverend Norbert Chopik, who defied the Nazis and lost his life for it, the Reverend James Reeb, martyred in Selma in the cause of civil rights, and there are many more. Yet we don't lift up our own luminaries above all others, saying that only with them the truth will be found. We are led to deeper wisdom and action by many outside our own faith story who have spoken to the human condition and the ethical demand to leave the world better than we found it. Those whom we call prophets include courageous leaders of direct social action, but also those who call for an inner revolution that must precede any transformation in the wider world, right? The revolution is outside, but it can also be inside. Many theologians have reflected on the inseparability of justice and compassion and love in our engagement with the world. Justice without compassion can lead to legalism and brutality. Loving without a commitment to justice can become mere sentimentality. The powers and structures of evil surround us, and many religious doctrines try to explain them. But we have turned away from theological disputes about evil, focusing instead on faithful encouragement to stand up and to confront it. So, Kathleen's not talking anymore, I'm talking now. So that brings up another aspect of our second source. It gives us a tactic for confronting evil, because we don't dissect where evil comes from or worry too much about whether evil comes from nature or nurture, although that's a great topic to debate. We don't take seriously the idea that all people are born evil and are in need of salvation, and we don't necessarily believe there's a devil over our shoulder trying to lead us astray. Instead, we target our efforts towards evil deeds and evil systems. And I find that idea refreshingly practical. And I appreciate that Kathleen Rollens pointed out that prophets not only encourage us to change the world, they also encourage us to change ourselves. Those prophets who call for inner revolution. So I can expand my own personal prophet list to include the Buddha and Thich Nhat Hanh and the ancient yogis. And some prophets did both, the inner transformation and the societal transformation. In fact, I think one might argue that the most successful prophets have done both. I mean, our New Testament goes to great lengths to establish Jesus of Nazareth as a direct descendant of the prophets of the Hebrew Bible. It's kind of a way of giving him some serious street cred. But what really makes Jesus a prophet to me is that he was a social justice activist. He called out all kinds of hypocrisy and inequality and cruelty practiced by Roman oppressors and overly legalistic Judaism. But at the same time he was doing this societal stuff, he was getting really ordinary individuals to take a serious look at themselves. So overall, I think what's really important about the second source is that it reminds us of the people who came before us, who we can learn from and gain inspiration from. The second source reminds us to confront evil, not talk about it, complain about it, but to speak up and do something about it. And finally, the second source reminds us how to go about this confrontation so we don't end up making things worse. For there to be justice, our justice-making must be rooted in compassion and the transformational power of love. Otherwise, we're just another bunch of angry people yelling about stuff. And I'd say that's like the last thing our world needs right now, right? So I invite you to keep your prophets close at heart, close in mind, whoever they might be, and invite them along with you on your life's journey. And feel free to rotate the pictures on your personal altar whenever needed. But always remember your prophets, their words and deeds, and allow them to encourage your own prophetic voice. I'd like to end today with some brief words from the Reverend Kathleen McTeague. Those who lived before us and suffered injustice before us have not melted into the dust and have not disappeared. They are with us still. The lives they lived hold us steady. We take them with us, and with them choose the deeper path of living.